So this is our final session of the Billy Graham Symposium here. My name is Alicia Kaufman. I'm Assistant Professor of History here at Baylor, and one of the people who put this event together along with Tommy Kidd and Philip Jenkins in the ISR. We're very grateful to the Institute for Studies of Religion and Truett and our Baylor faculty and staff for supporting this event, and also very grateful to all of you who are here. Anyone who was here this morning, we heard a very lively roundtable on Billy Graham and in international global context. So this one is a bit of a counterpart to that. It is a roundtable on Billy Graham and American Evangelicalism. Once again, we will have 3 short presentations. I'll introduce each presenter before he speaks, and then I will moderate some discussion among the presenters, and then we will open it up for audience participation at that point. So our first presenter is Ed Gilbreath, who I know from many years ago. We were both on the staff of Christianity Today publishing in the Chicago area. He is author of Reconciliation Blues, A Black Evangelical's Inside View of White Christianity, Birmingham Revolution, Martin Luther King Jr.'s Epic Challenge to the Church, and Gospel Trailblazer, an African-American preacher's historic journey across racial lines. He's an award-winning journalist, formerly with Christianity Today. He currently serves as the Executive Director of Communications for the Evangelical Covenant Church denomination. Ed received his bachelor's in communication from Judson University and master's in philosophy of history from Olivet Nazarene University, and he is going to talk to us in a presentation titled Pulling Down the Ropes: Howard Jones, Martin Luther King, and Billy Graham's Pioneering Forays Against Racial Segregation.
Thank you, Alicia, and to Tommy and Philip and Grant Wacker, who I'm told is the guilty party for me being here, primarily. Thank you so much. It's a privilege to be able to hang out with the academic folks for a while, and it's been a wonderful last couple of days for me to visit Waco for the first time. Pulling Down the Ropes is the title, and talking about the pioneering forays against Billy Graham's pioneering forays against racial segregation. But after hearing Ed Stetzer yesterday talk about Graham and his work in race relations, not so much being a pioneer as much as an early adopter, I wish I would have heard that first. It's an interesting way of thinking about it. But let me begin. During my childhood, Billy Graham was always a welcome guest in our home. I grew up in the 1970s and 80s in Rockford, Illinois, and I was adopted by an older African-American couple that loved me into the person that I am today. We grew up, and I grew up poor, but I was never unhappy. My parents came from the generation of black folks who stopped everything and celebrated anytime they'd see black people represented on TV. I don't know if anyone else is familiar with that kind of thing. But if there was an African-American news reporter on television, it would be, Stella, come and see. There's a black news reporter. Or if there were an African-American contestant on a TV game show, Stella, there's a black woman on The Price is Right. We enjoyed a lot of TV in the 70s and 80s, and a variety of TV shows that we watched in those days. I have vivid memories of shows like, growing up as a little kid, Barnaby Jones. Anybody remember Barnaby Jones? Sanford and Son, yes. The Waltons, and Good Times. Oh, James Evans and crew. But every so often, the primetime lineup would be preempted by a friendly white preacher named Billy Graham. At first, I was perturbed that he would come out of nowhere to disrupt our television routine. But as I grew older, I found myself watching his crusades, the simple but heartfelt sermons that would culminate with the choir singing Just As I Am, and throngs of people coming forward. I found myself emotionally drawn in, but I also noticed something else. Sometimes there were black people on stage with Billy Graham. It didn't occur to me then how radical Billy Graham really was when it came to race relations and white evangelicalism. His firm conviction that Jesus died for all people and that segregation was unbiblical and that it was that we were all made in God's image, it created some challenges for him throughout his ministry. In many ways, his bold moves forward and his angst-ridden retreats backward on racial issues sort of set the tone for what would occur in the larger evangelical movement. White Christianity would develop a sort of schizophrenia around race relations. God made all people in his image, but we must follow the customs of our laws in our local communities. The church must lead the way in proclaiming the sinfulness of racism, but each individual must be transformed personally by Jesus to understand this. All people are the same in God's eyes, but we mustn't be too hasty or disruptive in pursuing social change. In this talk, I'd like to just talk briefly about Dr. Graham and explore a little bit of how Billy Graham came to symbolize evangelical courage in confronting 20th century racism and segregation, while at the same time reflecting evangelical timidity and its tendency to practice a one-dimensional understanding of the gospel, an understanding that routinely separates personal salvation from social justice. I'd like to start by sharing a bit about Howard Jones, who you can see up on the screen here with Billy. I had the honor of working with Dr. Jones on his 2003 autobiography, Gospel Trailblazer. There were many sides to Dr. Jones. He was a musician, a pastor, a family man, a missionary. But when I first met him in my role as an editor with Christianity Today, I wanted to interview him about his unique role as in evangelical history. You see, in 1957, he became the first African-American leader to join Billy Graham's organization. Jones, a native of Oberlin, Ohio, already had spent a lot of his life in the role of racial barrier breaker. In the 1940s, he and his wife Wanda attended Nyack Missionary Training Institute, now known as Nyack College, in metropolitan New York. The institute was affiliated with the Christian Missionary Alliance, a predominantly white denomination. After graduation, Jones pastored Bethany Alliance Church on Harlem's Lower East Side. Drawn to the lost souls outside the church walls, he formed an evangelistic outreach to New York's inner city neighborhoods. And along the way, this is very significant, he met a man named Jack Wurtson, a band leader turned minister whose Word of Life youth radio broadcasts and evangelistic rallies packed venues like Carnegie Hall. After 8 years in Harlem, Howard returned to Ohio and became the pastor of Smoot Memorial Alliance Church in Cleveland. During this time, an advertisement in Christian Life magazine turned his attention to Africa. A radio station in Liberia wanted recordings of Negro spirituals produced by African American churches. Howard's church choir decided to respond. They recorded songs, and Howard included some of his sermons, and they sent the tapes to the radio station. The station responded so enthusiastically that Howard began sending tapes regularly. Jones soon was inundated with mail from listeners across Africa who had been converted through his the messages on those radio programs. They said, Dr. Jones told me, they said it was the first time they had ever heard the voice of an American black man. This successful radio ministry would lead to the Joneses being invited to preach in Africa. They embarked on a 3-month tour, with Howard becoming the first African-American clergyman to hold major rallies in Africa. The people went wild, Howard said. They beat drums, chanted, and said, "Praise the Lord. We've seen the white missionary, but we've never seen a black preacher from America." For Howard, their enthusiasm disproved the narrow-minded notions American Christians harbored about African missions. White evangelicals believed that Africans would not respond to black American missionaries, Howard told me. We helped change that perception. Howard's efforts in African missions were groundbreaking, but his most significant contribution to dismantling the church's cultural prejudices came by way of a letter from Billy Graham. In the 1950s, Graham realized that his integrity as an evangelist would be measured by his response to America's struggle over race relations. Nearly a full century after the Civil War, Christians in the former Confederate states still balked at integration. In the 19th century, just going back a little bit, evangelist Dwight Moody had confronted the race issue head on. In 1876, he attracted both black and white audiences to meetings in Augusta, Georgia. But whites began complaining that blacks were filling the best seats. So the rally's sponsors divided the seating by race. Moody opposed the decision, but bowed to white pressure. In 1917, America's next superstar preacher, Billy Sunday, held special meetings for African Americans and visited black churches during a campaign in Atlanta. He had been sensitive to the plight of minorities since the start of his ministry as a Bible teacher for the Chicago YMCA. However, he drew the line when it came to holding integrated meetings. He knew that no national white Christian leader who wanted to remain in good standing could upset such social mores. Billy Graham faced a similar dilemma. During his early years of ministry, he never questioned the custom of segregated seating at his Southern crusades. But by 1952, the young celebrity preacher was wrestling with the hypocrisy of racial prejudice in the church. There is no scriptural basis for segregation, he told an audience in Jackson, Mississippi. It may be there are places where such is desirable to both races, but certainly not in the church. Blacks and a few whites greeted Graham's words enthusiastically, but most whites were critical. Under pressure, Graham softened his views. He said, "We follow the existing social customs in whatever part of the country in which we minister. I came to Jackson to preach only the Bible and not to enter into local issues." Nevertheless, Graham soon realized he could not detach this social issue from his spiritual message. In 1953, Graham upset the sponsors of his Chattanooga, Tennessee crusade when he spoke out against segregated seating. There, he famously removed the ropes separating the black and white seating before one of the meetings. A year later, the Supreme Court banned segregation in public schools. Emboldened by the court's decision, Graham vowed never again to hold segregated crusades. From then on, he began incremental but clear steps towards dismantling segregation in the American church. The last thing Jones expected when he returned from Africa in 1957 was a letter from Billy Graham. Graham was then in the early weeks of his 68-day crusade at New York's Madison Square Garden. He asked Jack Wyrtzen how to reverse the low minority turnout at the event. Graham realized it was important for his rallies to reflect the diversity of his host city, and he was eager to demonstrate his commitment to racial integration. The evangelist had already integrated his team with Akbar Abdul Haq, a gifted preacher from India, but he wanted to add an African American. Wyrtzen recommended Howard Jones. When Jones met the evangelist, Graham greeted him with a warm hug. Graham explained his situation and then invited Jones to join his team. Howard was wary about taking advantage of his church after having been gone to Africa on a missionary tour. But when Graham wrote to Jones's church, the congregation said they were thrilled to have their pastor borrowed by the world's most famous preacher. What came next was tougher. Graham asked Jones to sit on the platform with him in front of 18,000 people. A dozen other pastors and civic leaders sat with them, but Jones was the only African American on stage. News of Jones's inclusion on the team brought Graham an alarming number of angry letters. "You should not have a Negro on your team," they warned. "You're going to ruin your ministry by adding minorities. We may have no choice but to end our support." Dr. Jones told me, "What Billy did was radical. He weathered the barrage of angry letters and criticisms. He resisted the idea of playing it safe. There was never any hesitation on Billy's part. He knew it was God that was calling him to do it. But when Graham asked Jones how to increase minority turnout at the crusade, Jones gave him some hard truth. If they're not coming to you, you have to go where they are. Billy, you need to go to Harlem. And many of Graham's white colleagues said it was too dangerous. Those savages up there will kill you. But Graham knew Jones was right. Jones told me, the funny thing is, some of those whites who were saying, don't go to Harlem, were members of evangelical churches that were sending white missionaries to Africa. Jones organized a rally of more than 8,000 people in Harlem, followed the next week by an event in Brooklyn, where more than 10,000 blacks and other minorities came out to hear Graham. The events boosted black attendance at the crusade to 20% by the end of the campaign. For Graham, Jones's presence at the crusade would be one of the visibly substantive ways for his ministry to begin dismantling the power structures of segregation. And no doubt emboldened by Jones' influence, Graham would soon take it even further. To the chagrin and even contempt of many white Christians at the time, Graham became friendly with Martin Luther King Jr. and invited the young civil rights activist to provide a prayer during Graham's Madison Square Garden crusade in 1957. King had just come to national attention a year before with his leadership of the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott. At a private dinner during the New York crusade, Graham eagerly asked King how he had managed to keep the boycott so peaceful. Prayer, said King simply. Montgomery was a movement of prayer. For Graham, King would be a sort of living embodiment of the bond between the personal and social nature of the Christian gospel. But despite his courageous steps, Graham sometimes struggled to see the personal and social elements as part of a whole. Indeed, in 1963, during King's game-changing protest in Birmingham, Alabama, the same Billy Graham who had praised the burgeoning civil rights movement's success in Montgomery suggested that his good personal friend, Martin Luther King, might be stoking the racial tension in Birmingham by moving too fast, and that he should put the brakes on a little bit. Graham added, "What I would like to see now is a period of quietness in which moderation prevails." In 1958, Howard Jones joined the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association as a full-time associate, serving for more than 35 years until he retired in 1994. He participated in countless evangelistic campaigns to Africa and elsewhere. He helped recruit Canadian evangelist Ralph Bell as Graham's second black associate, and was instrumental in a variety of humanitarian initiatives on behalf of the BGEA. Howard played a strong role in showing Billy the importance of meeting physical needs as well as the spiritual, Ralph Bell told me in an interview. During Graham's 1966 London crusade, a hotel refused Jones a room because of his skin color. Graham told his entire team to vacate the premises and find a hotel that welcomed all races. In South Africa in 1973, after years of resisting, the Graham Crusade went to South Africa during the height of apartheid. Graham preached, Jesus was a man. He was human. He was not a white man. He was not a black man. He came from that part of the world that touches Africa and Asia and Europe, and he probably had brown skin. Christ belongs to all people. He belongs to the whole world. Jones saw Graham's boldness up close, and it troubled him greatly when critics, both black and white, questioned the evangelist's commitment to racial reconciliation and justice. I lost a lot of my black friends who thought I should leave Billy, Jones told me. But the people who accuse Billy of not being vocal enough against racism and other social issues have not seen what goes on behind the scenes. They do not know the man's heart. In November 2010, Howard Jones died at the age of 89. His life is marked by many firsts that helped shape racial progress in the modern evangelical movement. First African-American evangelist in Africa, first president of the National Black Evangelical Association, First African American inducted into the National Religious Broadcasters Hall of Fame. Of course, first Black associate with the BGEA. But among all those accomplishments, partnering with Graham during the turbulent days of race relations in America was the highest highlight of his illustrious career. Thank you.
We'll hear next from William Martin, Graham biographer and distinguished scholar. He is the Harry and Hazel Chavan Emeritus Professor in the Department of Sociology at Rice University and Chavan Senior Fellow at Rice's Baker Institute, where he directs two programs, Religion and Public Policy and Drug Policy, and he would be happy to tell you how those things are related, not separate. After receiving his BA and MA at Abilene Christian University, he graduated from Harvard Divinity School in 1963 and received his PhD from Harvard in 1969. During his 50 years at Rice, 38 as a professor of sociology, he received numerous teaching awards, including a Lifetime Award for Excellence in Teaching. In addition to nearly 90 articles in Texas Monthly, his writing has appeared in The Atlantic, Esquire, Harper's, and in professional journals. His books include A Prophet with Honor, The Billy Graham Story, and With God on Our Side, The Rise of the Religious Right in America, the companion volume to a PBS miniseries of the same title. Dr. Martin.
Thank you, Alicia. 40 years ago this month, I was writing an article about Billy Graham for Texas Monthly. It was not a puff piece, but Mr. Graham liked it and said so. And I didn't expect to spend 40 years, nearly half of my life, tied so tightly to him and to his matchless ministry. But it's been a blessing, and I am pleased to be part of this program here and appreciate those who have organized it and invited me. Billy Graham resisted the temptations of money and sex more successfully than some of his colleagues, but his fascination with and access to power brought him great recognition and opportunities to accomplish a great deal. It also came close to compromising his integrity and revealing some of his vulnerabilities. By 1950, Graham had experienced notable popular acclaim, won respect in evangelical circles, and shown that he would have no trouble financing his ministry. The key realm he had yet to penetrate was politics, and since much of his preaching featured political themes, he sought to ingratiate himself with political figures with an eagerness that sometimes seemed almost desperate. His first long-sought success came when he had a visit with President Harry Truman in 1950. Several people have already talked about this, but it's worth mentioning a little bit. It turned out badly. After he and Cliff Barris, Grady Wilson, and Jerry Bevin had a cordial conversation with the president in the Oval Office, a clutch of reporters persuaded them to pose for a picture while praying on the White House lawn. And the next morning, newspapers all over America ran a photograph of these young innocents dazzling in their white suits and poised on one knee like a gospel quartet. And the stories and the photographs irritated Truman mightily. And he gave word that he instructed his aides that when Graham was there in 1952, that they were to decisively turn down any request for a return visit. Graham professed neutrality in the 1952 campaign, but it became clear early on that his choice was Dwight Eisenhower. In fact, in 1951, he had traveled to Eisenhower's NATO headquarters outside Paris to urge him to run. A few days before the November election, Graham revealed to the press that he had conducted a personal survey of 200 churchmen and religious editors from 30 states and 22 denominations and found that 77% favored him over Adlai Stevenson. During Ike's 2 terms, he sought Graham's counsel on such matters as racial tensions that were mounting in that time, and Graham dropped by the White House on his way to foreign missions just to let the president know where he would be going and to see if there were any special diplomatic opportunities he would like for him to perform. And on return, he dropped by the White House to report what he had seen and heard. It was a great encouragement to evangelical Christians to see that their most notable spokesman was welcome in the halls of power in this country, and throughout much of the world. A contact with the White House, of course, led to contact and friendship with Richard Nixon. He quickly became one of the vice president's most ardent, enthusiastic boosters. He commended Nixon for his sincerity, strong convictions, and humility, and his all-important sense of humor. And he characterized him profusely publicly as a splendid churchman. In private, he urged Nixon to please go to church and to mention scripture and make religious references in his speeches to assure himself of Protestant support in case he was running against the Roman Catholic John F. Kennedy. He organized and hosted a secret meeting in Montreux, Switzerland, of 25 Protestant leaders to discuss how they could block Kennedy's election. Norman Vincent Peale attended that meeting and himself organized a follow-up effort in Washington after he came back, and that turned out to be a public relations disaster for Peale. Billy Graham didn't participate in that one, but as one writer put it, his fingerprints were all over it. On the eve of the election, Graham wrote a piece for Life magazine commending Nixon, but he had such severe second thoughts about it that he persuaded the publisher Henry Luce to withdraw it. A few months after the election, Nixon ventured that had the article run, it may have well made the difference in the election, and he may well have been right. Kennedy and Graham were never close friends, but JFK was wise enough to keep cordial relationships with him, at least a semblance of cordiality. Still, Graham must have felt that his return to favor at the White House would have to wait until the GOP returned to power. Well, in feeling that way, he underestimated Lyndon Johnson. Graham and Johnson had met in the 1950s and had maintained polite contact, mostly at Johnson's initiative. But immediately after Kennedy's assassination in 1963, Graham contacted the new president to let him know that he would be praying for him and stood by to be ready to help in any way that he could in the difficult days ahead. Well, whether for spiritual or political reasons, Johnson eagerly accepted the offer. Within a week after he moved to the White House, he summoned Graham to Washington, and a visit scheduled for 15 minutes stretched to 5 hours, as two farm boys who had ridden their talent, ambition, and energy to the pinnacle of their respective professions found out they had more to offer each other than either one of them had ever imagined. Without question, and apart from the genuine affection that he felt for Graham, LBJ understood the advantages of being Billy's buddy. And Graham understood that he served to legitimize Johnson particularly to an evangelical constituency, particularly in the South and Southwest. I think he was attracted to me, at least partially, because I was well known in Texas, Graham said. I think he was more afraid of what the Baptist Standard was going to say about him than of the Washington Post or the New York Times. But he also felt that Johnson's religiosity was largely genuine. During a 1967 visit to the ranch on the Pertinalis, and that is the proper pronunciation, the president told Graham that he wanted him to preach his funeral at the ranch. And he says, obviously, there'll be members of the press there, and I don't know how many, but they may come from all over the world. And Billy, I want you to look into those cameras and just tell them what Christianity is all about. Tell them how they can be sure that they can go to heaven. I want you to preach the gospel. But somewhere in there, I want you to tell them a few things I did for this country. Now, late in 1967, when he was considering whether to run for the presidency again, Richard Nixon asked Billy to join him in Key Biscayne. And the two men spent several days together talking, watching football games, praying, studying the Bible, long walks on the beach, and speculating about whether Nixon should run for the Republican nomination, and if he should get it, could he win? Well, because of his loyalty to Johnson, Graham withheld his counsel at first, but finally he said all Nixon needed to hear. Well, if you don't, you'll worry about it for the rest of your life, won't you? Well, that was enough for both of them. And Nixon later said that Graham had been more responsible than anyone else for his decision to run, and Billy immediately resumed knitting the fabric of fellowship that would very nearly become a pall on his ministry. I don't have time to provide details of Graham's efforts during the campaign and the presidency to help Nixon, but they were many and varied. He fervently wanted to believe that America and Richard Nixon were involved in the work of God. Bedrock beliefs can withstand enormous challenge, but never in Graham's life had he been forced to deal with the cognitive dissonance posed by the issue that ended Richard Nixon's presidency, Watergate. As evidence of the break-in and coverage and cover-up came to life, Graham acknowledged that he was confused and sick about the whole thing, but he said he felt certain that the president was not seriously involved in that, since his moral and ethical principles wouldn't allow him to do anything illegal like that. When he finally read the transcripts of the White House tapes in the spring of 1974, what he found devastated him. He wept, he threw up, and he almost lost his innocence about Richard Nixon, even though he was more troubled by profanity than by political espionage, bribery, suborning perjury, and other strikes at constitutional government. The pain of that perception grew even stronger and sharper as he considered the possibility that Eisenhower and Kennedy and Johnson might also have shown him only one of several faces. And inevitably, it led him to confront the possibility that his unwitting collusion in helping do unto others as had been done unto him. Early in 1976, Graham said that he was just going to stay out of the election that year between Ford and Jimmy Carter, and I'm just going to pass over that. He stayed out of it pretty much, so I'm going to stay out of it right now. In Christianity Today's first issue of 1980, when the religious right was dramatically flexing its political muscles, Graham warned his newly politicized brethren to be wary of exercising political influence, lest they lose their spiritual impact. He repeated that warning in several settings, and he called Jerry Falwell to tell him, the hard right has no interest in religion except to manipulate it. Given that reticence, Graham declined to jump aboard Ronald Reagan's campaign train, but he gave it a well-publicized friendly wave. He was holding a crusade in Indianapolis at the time of the Indiana primary, and he joined Governor Reagan for breakfast and congratulated him warmly on the strong showing in the Texas primary the day before. And all three major networks, TV networks, suggested that meeting had given Reagan a remarkably well-timed boost. Graham claimed that he visited the White House more under Reagan's administration than at any other president, with the possible exception with Johnson, but the visits seemed to have been more personal and pastoral than political. In an early conversation with me, Mr. Graham chuckled and said, Reagan isn't really interested in politics. He just wants to talk about the old days in Hollywood. Graham had met George H.W. Bush in 1957 during his Madison Square Garden crusade. And he and Ruth had spent several short vacations at the family's summer home in Kennebunkport, Maine. At the 1988 Republican convention, he led a prayer, and he sat next to Barbara Bush throughout her husband's acceptance speech, looking every inch as if he felt comfortable in the Republican box, even though he told the Associated Press, I always stay politically neutral. He insisted that Bush never ask him for a political favor. But on the evening of January 16, 1991, when American and Allied forces launched the devastating air attacks on Iraq, Graham's invited and well-publicized presence in the White House and his leading a worship service and for key political and military leaders the next morning provided a powerful symbolic legitimacy to the president's claim to be conducting a just war. When the nation decided to choose Bill Clinton to keep George H.W. Bush from having a second term, Graham found much to admire in Bill Clinton and was pleased to lead prayers at both of his inaugurations and joined him in a moving prayer service in the aftermath of the bombing of the Oklahoma City Federal Building in April 1995. During his 2005 evangelistic crusade in New York City, Mr. Graham was joined on the stage by Bill and Hillary Clinton. And calling them his wonderful friends of many years, he said they're a great couple. And he recalled having told the president that when he left the presidency, he should be an evangelist because he had all the gifts and just leave his wife to run the country. Well, Hillary turned to Bill and they exchanged high fives. And the next day, Franklin made it clear that his father had been joking and certainly did not intend for his comments to be taken as an endorsement for Hillary Clinton. George W. Bush has said many times that a private walk on the beach at the Bush compound in Kennebunkport in 1985 turned his life around. He led me to the path and I began walking. Now, though Graham took pleasure in that development, he has said, by the way, he doesn't remember the conversation, but it was the kind of conversation he had with people, so that's not unusual. But on the weekend before the election, when Graham was holding a crusade in Jacksonville, Bush and his wife, Laura, joined Billy and Franklin for a private breakfast. And then they spoke to a small group of reporters to make brief statements. And Graham said, "I don't endorse candidates, but I've come as close to it now, I guess now, as at any time in my life because I think it's extremely important. I've already voted. I'll just let you guess who I voted for, and my whole family the same way." Well, that election was decided by fewer than 500 votes, 5 of them from the Supreme Court. Were it not for that fortuitous 1985 conversation with Mr. Graham, George W. Bush might not have become governor, then president, and the Middle East might not have achieved the tranquil democracy produced by the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Graham followed the 2008 presidential campaign on television, and he welcomed candidate John McCain to his home. A temporary health episode forced a visit with Obama to be postponed, but President Obama did come to Montreat in April 2010, a first for an incumbent president. With Franklin present, they met for half an hour and prayed together, preacher for president and president for preacher, which may also be a first. In early 2011, Mr. Graham told Christianity Today that if he had a chance to go back and do anything differently, I would have steered clear of politics. Looking back, I know I sometimes crossed the line, and I wouldn't do that now. But in October 2012, with the election only weeks away, Franklin brought Governor Mitt Romney to Montreat to visit his father. And that led immediately to a report that Billy Graham had said he would do all he could to help Governor Romney in the campaign, and that Franklin had pledged to help them turn out evangelical Christians for the governor. Well, because of Mr. Graham's re-entering the political arena out of due season, some observers charged that Franklin had steered his father in that direction. Franklin turned away reporters who were seeking confirmation from Mr. Graham himself on the grounds that his father's infirmities made that impossible. I found no record of any substantive conversation between Mr. Graham and the current president, although Donald and Melania Trump did attend Mr. Graham's 95th birthday party in Asheville 5 years ago today. Their picture appeared prominently in the January 2014 issue of Decision magazine. In 2016, Franklin led a Decision America tour that featured rallies at the capitals of all 50 states with the expressed intention to put God back in the political process. He said, "Donald Trump has changed. I think God is working on his heart and in his life." It seems that Trump and God had barely known each other before that. And when a substantial minority of voters elected Trump president, Franklin promised not to be surprised. His explanation was simple: God showed up. Because he was a trustworthy man of deep integrity, Mr. Graham found it difficult to believe that not all people seeking or holding high office shared those traits in similar measure, even when evidence of their faulty character was no real secret. But I think he did learn. We can never know for sure, but hypothetically, should he ever have been faced with a candidate whose amorality, bigotry, corruption, pathological narcissism, total disregard for truth, and fundamental meanness were apparent to all with eyes to see and ears to hear, I choose to believe Billy Graham would have withheld his approval and suggest that other evangelicals do the same, lest they incur indelible stain. But like Mr. Graham, I always stay politically neutral.
It occurs to me I neglected to tell you what the title of Bill's comments were. It was All the President's Man. It's a good title. I wanted to make sure you got to hear it. Our last speaker is Roger E. Olson. He is the Foy Valentine Professor of Christian Theology and Ethics at Baylor's Truett Theological Seminary. He holds the PhD in Religious Studies from Rice University and the MA in Religious Studies from North American Baptist Seminary. Dr. Olson studied theology at the University of Munich with Wolfhart Pannenberg and wrote his doctoral dissertation on Pannenberg's Doctrine of God. He has published 20 books, many of them dealing with American evangelicalism, and the title of his remarks is Billy Graham as the Unofficial Pope of American Evangelicalism.
Thank you very much. Later this month, the Evangelical Studies Group of the American Academy of Religion will meet in Denver and once again take up the question, what is an evangelical? And of course, this has been debated before and seemingly never ends. And what I'd like to tell them, in case they don't remember, and they're younger, the leaders of that group are younger and maybe don't remember this, that the very first 3 meetings of the Evangelical Studies Group of the American Academy of Religion were on that subject. Who is an evangelical? What does it mean to be an evangelical? And that was in the 1980s. And I was there for the last of those 3 sessions, led by Rob Johnston and Donald Dayton, the founders of the Evangelical Studies Group. And I'll never forget, the room was packed with evangelical scholars and others. And after all these panel sessions, they had not really come to any consensus on what evangelical is. And there was a sense of frustration, a cloud of frustration in the room that you could just almost feel, because this was the end of that series. And suddenly, a man at the very back of the room raised his hand and stood, and I recognized him as a Lutheran theologian. And he said, I propose that an evangelical is anyone who loves Billy Graham. And the room broke out in loud applause. In other words, the evangelical scholars gathered there were saying, yeah, that's pretty much it. We can't really do any better than that. Well, let me launch into my talk about Billy Graham as the Pope, or unofficial Pope of evangelicalism, and I'll explain what I mean. I begin with some necessary qualifications. First, by no means did Billy Graham consider himself anything like a pontiff of the evangelical movement or of anything else. He was one of the most humble, self-effacing men and never aspired to infallibility or really even authority. So when I describe him as Pope of evangelicalism, I'm talking about how he functioned within the post-fundamentalist, post-World War II American evangelical coalition movement. And that was probably in spite of his own intentions and aspirations, or lack of them. Second qualification, by evangelicalism, I mean that coalition of mostly American, and by extension British and other conservative Protestant Christians who considered themselves neither fundamentalists nor liberals, and who valued the Bible as uniquely inspired and authoritative as God's word written, and who came together, especially in the 1940s, but through the 1960s, to provide a trans-denominational support group as a kind of third way in American Protestantism. This evangelical movement was held loosely together by certain institutions and organizations, such as, of course, the National Association of Evangelicals, founded in the early 1940s, but also Christianity Today, Incorporated, not just the magazine, but the organization, and the Coalition of Christian Colleges and Universities, et cetera, et cetera. There are many such evangelical organizations, and they all kind of interconnect and work with each other. My point, however, is that no binding power in this post-World War II, post-fundamentalist evangelical coalition was stronger than the personality of Billy Graham and the influence of his empire of organizations, which included Christianity Today, of which he served as chairman of the board for many years. Billy Graham was, I propose, the glue that held this post-World War II, post-fundamentalist evangelical coalition and movement together. Notably, upon his deep retirement in the late 1990s, that movement began to disintegrate. And I, for one, consider it now gone. So with what authority do I talk about Billy Graham? I never met him, unlike some others in this room. I've read several biographies of him, but feel especially informed by his own autobiography, Just As I Am, which I reviewed in a lengthy article at the request of the Minneapolis Star-Tribune when it was published and I was living in the Twin Cities. My uncle, who served as president of our little Pentecostal denomination for 25 years, was on the national board of the National Association of Evangelicals and knew Billy Graham personally. I served on the editorial board of Christianity Today, first as a consulting editor and then finally as contributing editor for many years. And I had many occasions to speak at length with Christianity Today's editors, including especially David Neff and Mark Golly. I once asked Neff what it was like to edit a magazine whose chairman of the board was Billy Graham. He responded that it was like living in a house with a 900-pound gorilla in the living room. Well, he wasn't comparing Billy Graham's character to that of a gorilla, of course. He only meant that they, the editors, had to always consider what Billy Graham would think before publishing anything even slightly controversial. Now, admittedly, my claim about Billy Graham's role in evangelicalism is impressionistic and anecdotal, but I think it is, nevertheless, accurate. To put it bluntly, it seems to me that for about 30 to 40 years, evangelical leaders especially defined their movement by reference to Billy Graham. He functioned as the figurehead leader of the movement, with such power of influence and example that whichever way he moved on an issue became the norm. He functioned as the almost universally acknowledged gold standard of evangelical leadership. This function extended beyond character and ethics into evangelical theology. Of course, I'm not claiming that Billy Graham was a theologian per se, but my claim is that his posture toward and relation to doctrine set a standard and norm for theological specificity and generality. Put otherwise, throughout the 1950s and into the 1970s, at least those decades, the movement evangelicals were by and large willing to set aside denominational particularities or at least relativize them while holding firmly to broad evangelical orthodoxy as modeled by Graham and his representatives. I know for a fact that many evangelical leaders, when confronted with a theological question, ask themselves, what would Billy Graham say? That was especially true when it came to what innovations in theology could be tolerated. I could go on a long time with this case for Billy Graham as the evangelical pope by default, not by intention, I want to make clear, but my time is limited, so let me offer a couple of clear illustrations from my own memory and experience. I will never forget the impact of Billy Graham's journey to Oral Roberts University to deliver the sermon at that university's dedication in 1967. We Pentecostals were not sure of our place among evangelicals, and many evangelicals were not sure of it either. But when Billy Graham did that, he implicitly put a good housekeeping seal of approval on Pentecostalism as a full part of the evangelical movement. Now, that was at a time when Oral Roberts was still Pentecostal, before he became United Methodist and then Independent Charismatic. Suddenly, most non-fundamentalist evangelicals dropped their concerns about whether Trinitarian Pentecostals were evangelicals or not, and believed they were, because Billy Graham delivered the keynote address at the dedication of Oral Roberts University. I will never forget the impact of Billy Graham's implicit endorsement of the Jesus People movement in the early 1970s. Many evangelicals had serious qualms about the so-called Jesus freaks until Billy Graham grew his hair long and started showing up at Jesus People festivals and inviting noted Jesus freaks like Arthur Blessitt to meet with him and even participate in his crusade, such as the one in Northern Ireland in 1971. Billy Graham's embrace of the Jesus People movement convinced many wary evangelicals to look upon it more favorably than they would otherwise have. I think those two examples well illustrate how highly evangelical leaders of various Protestant traditions regarded Billy Graham and how he, perhaps unintentionally and over a period of time, contributed by his example to a kind of genericizing of American evangelicalism in which denominational, theological, and ethical particularities tended to take a back seat to a kind of broad theology of salvation that could legitimately find many different expressions. Now let me end this by switching metaphors. It seems to me that Billy Graham was, to the post-World War II, post-fundamentalist evangelical movement, what Martin Luther King Jr. was to the 1950s through the 1970s civil rights movement. There was, as we all know, real diversity within the civil rights movement, and yet there was also unity. Martin Luther King, as an icon, even after his death, provided the unity, not only organizationally, but also ideologically, by example. That's what Billy Graham did for mid to late 20th century evangelicalism. And this isn't part of my manuscript, but I want to end by saying I think that's why there is no such thing anymore, because he's gone. Thank you.
Is that the button I'm supposed to push? Okay, great. Right? Yes. That ending point, I would love to hear from Ed and Bill. Do you agree that the evangelicalism for which Billy Graham was the glue no longer exists?
You know, I'm not that much of a student of the whole movement now, but I think that makes. I was thinking about it as he said. I think that makes sense. The movement had more of a unity, more of a under when Mr. Graham was alive and at his peak. Now there are other people who, whether they want to be the next Billy Graham, and probably not, they're happy to have their own. And I'm not being critical of them, but having their huge church and their whole there are so many large tents out there, and they're not particularly willing to have. They're not interested anymore in saying, what would Billy Graham think as much, I think. There are so much of what is now part of the evangelical movement is part of has the prosperity aspect to it, which doesn't seem to me to fit very well under Mr. Graham's or classic evangelicalism. As you may have just guessed from what I was saying, I think evangelicalism is doing itself terrible harm by its political involvement now. That's my opinion, and I say it also not only because I feel that way, but because I hear people saying, "What is happening with these evangelical Christians?" And I said, "Well, I'm not completely sure, but I'm unhappy about it too."
Yeah, I agree. I don't know if there could be one person who could be a Billy Graham today. I think it's interesting that the same thing is sort of said about Martin Luther King. Who's the next king? Who will be the next king? Who's the king right now on the scene? And we ask the same about Billy Graham. And I think the culture has changed in a way where the conditions just don't allow for that kind of single personality who could wield that kind of influence.
In considerable measure because of the success Mr. Graham had. And not trying to say I'm the only one, but in building up people. And of course, most prominently, and this was mentioned, I guess, by Ed Stetzer yesterday, that, and perhaps by Graham, but that Mr. Graham, when asked, who's going to follow you, he said to me, he says, I don't think there will be anyone quite like me come along. So there are lots of bright, wonderful young person, but the circumstances have changed. Now, just as I was saying earlier, and you were saying there, no one can. When Billy Graham came to town, you say we're on, all the evangelical and beyond that, we're on board. Now, well, no, we've got our thing going over here, and it's very large as well. But also, what Billy Graham would say is that I'm not interested. One of the most inspiring things, certainly the high point of my research on Mr. Graham's, on the book, was going to the 1986 International Conference for Itinerant Evangelists in Amsterdam, and seeing something like 8,600 evangelists, some of them shoeless, some of them coming and never been in an airplane, didn't know where there were seats in airplanes, and a large, considerable number of women, increasing number of Pentecostals, and some of them going across, having dodged gunfire to get to the airports, being paid for and brought by the Billy Graham Association. And one I believe he was Indian, but he says, it would not all have been possible without Billy Graham. And I think that what Billy Graham's, the people he saw as his successors, and that was one. There was one in 2000 that had a larger number. There were 25,000 people trained in those 3 international conferences, and then dozens of regional, what they call mini Amsterdams, training evangelists to do the work that Billy Graham had done. He said, these are my successors, the little Billy Grahams throughout the world, and I think that's the way he wanted it, and I think that's the current Billy Graham.
Are we sanitizing the category of evangelical to center it on Graham? And I'm thinking of back when we were at Christianity Today, we thought of ourselves as the flagship of evangelicalism. David Neff was a politically liberal Episcopalian. He wasn't representative of evangelicalism as the category had political salience. Were the positive things about Graham not representative of evangelicalism as a category with political salience? Another way of asking this question is, if Graham's poll of whoever he thought of his constituency, 77% went for Eisenhower, that's about the percent that say that they support Trump. Does that group have continuity beyond and besides whatever we might say Graham was holding together? Who were those evangelicals? Who are these evangelicals? And to say that they're led by Graham or Christianity Today, are we kidding ourselves?
I don't know the answer to that. As I was saying, I've been working on other things and keeping up just with Mr. Graham's. But I read Christianity Today, and that's I can't. But I've not been as I've not followed evangelicalism as a movement in my professional work. But it does seem to me that it's a pretty different makeup.
I'll just fill the silence here for a moment and say that, for me as a theologian, evangelical is a descriptor I accept with qualifications. For me, it has always meant a spiritual, theological orientation within Protestant Christianity, although I think there are Catholic evangelicals too. But it's a spiritual, theological orientation or ethos. For From time to time, the media kind of interprets it as political or interprets it in some other way. But there was a relatively cohesive movement for a while of people who shared that ethos. And Billy Graham seems to have been the one who held that together. I was on the steering committee of a Billy Graham associate evangelist, Leighton Ford's crusade in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, when I was in seminary. And almost every Protestant church, except the out-and-out liberal Protestant churches, were on board and came together and really cooperated, ironically, in spite of our deep differences. Nazarenes, Christian Reformed, that should give you an idea of how diverse it was. Pentecostals and Presbyterians, and they all came together around that crusade. And I don't see that happening anymore. We who share that ethos that I'm talking about have fallen into our own silos and really don't cross over at all.
I get the sense that Franklin's that his festivals don't have that kind of drawing power that he can. Of course, they don't go as long. They don't think they have the months-long preparation that Mr. Graham's crusades did. But I think it's a smaller group. And there are things I mentioned about the prosperity. Billy Graham, his daughters have told me that he really liked watching Joel Osteen, and Joel Osteen deeply very much admired Mr. Graham and loved that he was hearing that. But they belong to different different segments of if it's not one American evangelicalism, given that, I believe.
So that's what I love about evangelicalism is just that, the sort of messiness of it. And I'd like to think, and maybe I'm naive, but there's still this sort of messy middle where you have all these different folks, different expressions that can somehow find a way to come together, rooted in Christ, and that good things can happen out of that. I think it's been poisoned, unfortunately, by the politics and other things now, but I'd like to think that's what CT, what Christianity Today, was able to sort of capture at its best. Whoever the editor is, I think being fair and honest about our flaws, but providing a way for different communities to come together to celebrate and to have conversations about what we do have in common.
Questions from the audience? Grant.
We all shake a little bit here.
No.
Well, I do anyway.
No. Elisha, you know as much about evangelical history as anyone in this room, and I would like to know how you would answer your own question.
How's it feel now?
He was my doctoral advisor. He's done this before. I think it is although I hear what Ed is saying about the messiness and also the big tent, people coming together, I think it is too neat and tidy and positive to think of evangelicalism as centered on Graham or Christianity Today. But it does depend on what conversation you're having. Are you having a conversation about what might distinguish evangelicals from the Protestant mainline? And part of that is what periodicals they read, that's their identity group. That's a somewhat different conversation than you're having with a political pollster. How is this a political block of voting a category that you're going to ask about on exit polls? And that doesn't really arise until 1980, when Graham is getting somewhat less political. So in that sense, you're talking about a different phase of evangelical history, and you're also talking about a somewhat different constituency at the same time. If you're having a conversation about evangelical theology, then that, yet again, the centers are somewhat different and the boundaries are somewhat different. But I get concerned about things like Ed's observation that Graham and the white evangelical Christianity that he represented had a schizophrenia around race, of saying certain things and then backing it up, certain kinds of courage and certain kinds of timidity and emphasis on personal salvation, too often against social justice, although saying those things together but then acting one way or the other. I don't want something like race to get lost in these mainline versus evangelical discussions. I think that the social context and who these constituents actually are matters, and I'm not sure how to keep that in view when having the other versions of this conversation.
You know, a name just came to my mind, and I don't know how many recognize it, but I remember when Billy Graham latched on to E.V. Hill as a black partner, not to work under him, but to be alongside of him. And he too was on the platform of some Billy Graham crusades. And so my point would be that Billy Graham showed us the way, and he got part way, and we followed a little bit behind him. And I'm talking about white evangelicals. But it made a real difference in our attitudes. We didn't arrive, of course, but I mean, Billy Graham was a pathfinder in race relations among American evangelical Christians.
And backsliding was always an option.
Well, I have put it this way, that Billy Graham was seldom out in the front of the parade, but he was almost always in front of his unit and moving in the right direction.
Other questions from the audience? Uta.
I'm really, really enjoying this panel, and I do have a question that is inspired by Ed's fabulous presentation on race and how Graham and the movement struggled with the category of race, but also with the brilliant keynote that we heard on Ruth Graham. And my question relates to the category of gender. So when we talk about the transformation of US evangelicalism with a focus on Graham, it is overshadowed by this male, all-male prophet. But I would like to invite all of you to reflect a little bit on what he did to the role of women in the evangelical movement. So because on the one hand, maybe hindered them by the way he spoke about, well, basically endorsing women evangelists, handing over to one of the daughters. But on the other hand, I can assure you, when you read the reports from the women who run the prayer committees for the crusades, there's an incredible empowerment of women within the crusade machinery. So my question to you, how important is gender, and what did Graham do to the gender of American evangelicalism?
Well, I think he helped, for sure. Again, at the 1986 Amsterdam conference, a substantial number, a minority to be sure, but a substantial number of women were there. And perhaps the best preacher there was Anne. But there were Pentecostal women preachers there as well. But in talking with him about that, and also talking with Anne about the interaction and how at first her mother thought that she should be staying home, and she was really worried that Anne could do her Bible teaching and neglect her. Would that mean neglecting her family? And when they came to visit her one time, it was the first time to hear her with those large classes, which she'd been doing for a good while, that they was able to go home. The children were all fed and clean, and the food was ready to turn. Their mother said, sort of felt, okay, that's okay. But Mr. Graham was saying that I think there's some, he talked about the mission field. There are women missionaries who are certainly as capable as any man, or more capable. And then he went on to say, I think I'm moving toward thinking that women, it's fine for women to be pastors, and I think it's going in that direction, and I approve.
Did he ever actually say that, or you think he was going to say that?
No, he said it to me.
Oh, he said it to you. Well, I just want to say that mine is, don't interpret my presentation as totally positive. I think this is an area where Billy Graham failed us, because I grew up Pentecostal, and we had ordained women. Both my birth mother and my stepmother were ordained women, pastors, alongside my father. And Amy Semple McPherson was a great hero of ours, and most of the elder people in my denomination had been her associate evangelists, and I heard all these great stories about her. And we had women church planters, women evangelists, women pastors. What's happened to that in those evangelical denominations that kind of got sucked into this generic evangelicalism and lost their particularities? And I'm thinking of Nazarenes, for example, and other holiness churches that used to have lots of women pastors. Pentecostals, Assemblies of God, hardly have any women pastors anymore, and they used to have many. And I think this is where Billy Graham kind of let us down by not saying that publicly. And these denominations that had women pastors let go of that. In fact, one that I know of, the Christian Missionary Alliance, changed their policy on it so that women couldn't be pastors. And that is a result of, I think, those denominations getting taken up into this kind of evangelical movement that's very generic and doesn't have particularities with it. It's not messy enough, I think.
It's also a respectability politics, right? Every Christian movement that's gone from fringe to having more cultural capital, more access to political power, what gets thrown off that boat is women's authority over and over again.
My wife did her doctoral dissertation on women in Texas, Baptist women in Texas from 1870 to 1920, and she did a lot of her work here at Baylor. But she said what happens is when the organization gets big enough and starts really bringing in the money, then the men take over. There are those who say that same things have happened since 1940.
So thanks so much for this panel. I have two questions. First is a question about Howard Jones. So for Roger and Ed, because I teach Jones's work in my classes on evangelicalism in America, and how do we think about Jones in relation to not just Billy Graham and American evangelicalism, but in relation to the quote-unquote black church? Okay, because you mentioned King, Roger, as a representative of the civil rights movement, though there's diversity, often people reference King as a representative of the black church. But how does Jones fit in relation to that tradition? This is a point where many of my students really have trouble thinking about a figure like Jones. So I'd love to get your responses about that. And then my second question is for Bill. And to what extent do you think then Franklin Graham, as the head currently of the BGEA, is living out the legacies of his own father? So what's the connection? How would you interpret somebody like Franklin Graham today?
Okay, I'll start. I think there's no question that that Howard Jones was sort of a product of a sort of white evangelical expression as a member of the Christian Missionary Alliance, and the sort of middle class black churches that he pastored sort of reflected that in their theology and their approach. I think, however, for instance, in his role as the president of the National Black Evangelical Association, there's spaces where African Americans from different expressions could come together and find commonality and bond around the issues of the day that affected all of them, regardless of where they came from. And I think that was a space where he was able to express that and was able to sort of shift roles a little bit. I think he was predominantly a sort of a Billy Graham evangelical, if you want to say that, but he was able to sort of code switch when necessary and speak in different environments, and that's why he was so effective, I think, in New York and rallying groups to come together to then help populate the Crusades there at Madison Square Garden.
One of the things, well, I mean, Anne said something today, we're talking about Nelson Bell. And last night, Grant was talking about Franklin being Ruth's son. I think you were talking about the word, yes. Franklin being Ruth's son. And I've thought that too, but Anne put that in sharper focus, that he was it may be even clearer to say he was Nelson Bell's grandson. Because Franklin is willing to say, here, no. We're going to do this, we're not going to, well, you're going to lose a lot of people, I don't care. And I think that while he's been certainly successful in many respects, and I have great admiration for Samaritan's Purse, and I contribute to it. But clearly, much of people who are outside evangelical circles see a clear difference between Franklin and his father. And I think that Billy Graham's, and this saying earlier, that his characteristic was to be inclusive, to widen the circle. And Franklin's is more willing, I think he's willing to say, well, if you don't want to do what I want to do, if you don't, if these are not the things you like, I don't care, go ahead. This is what we're going to do. This is the approach I'm taking. And that was so unlike his father's much more ironic, inclusive approach. I think he has shown that he can, that he's good at raising money. He's good at running a Samaritan's Purse, and he gets good crowds, particularly in other countries. He seems to be successful in his evangelistic work in other countries, and here it's the ones that I've paid more attention to. They kind of be short like that, so it's hard for me to and I haven't kept up with his statistics on decisions or things like that. But I think he intends, where he has maintained his father's legacy, and I think he has a real sense of wanting for the message his father preached, as he understands it, to continue. And he's been clever and very inventive, creative in the use of various kinds of media to spread his father's shadow over a much wider, and to produce, to project it longer after his father's death. One thing that started a number of years ago was when he got Trinity Broadcasting Network, TBN, to be the home for Billy Graham's classic sermons. That a Pentecostal network is carrying Billy Graham's classic sermons and services. That is reaching beyond the traditional evangelical borders. But I think Franklin, he also feels it's really important to be what he regards as theologically conservative and sound, and is less interested in, I think, in building relationships with people outside those circles. So he wants to preserve and continue his father's legacy. He does it in a pretty different way, and in some ways, I know that's off-putting to a number of people. I don't know, when we were talking about if Billy Graham comes to town, we're all on board. I don't know I just haven't looked at that, what the reaction is when you hear that Franklin's going to come and hold an 8-day festival here. I don't know what the effort is made from, let's say, Methodist or Presbyterians. And
I agree completely. He doesn't have the ecumenical spirit that his father had, and so there's no one that has that to kind of bring evangelicals together. And when Franklin Graham came here, I didn't really see any great gathering across denominational lines to attend and support. It was more political.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think. I have wondered if in the early 1940s, when the break between, when evangelicals decided we are not going to be fundamentalists now, I've wondered which direction Franklin would have gone.
Well, I know our time is short, but my own narrative on this is that what has happened, and this could start a whole new conversation, is that fundamentalists came out of the woods and began to call themselves evangelicals in the 1980s, especially, Jerry Falwell being the prominent example. I almost literally fell off my easy chair when I was watching him on the Phil Donahue show in the 1980s, and he called himself an evangelical. And I knew that he had been harshly critical of Billy Graham in the 60s.
Yeah.
And I just was going, what? And over a period of decades, it seems to me like the leading voices among evangelicals tend to be fundamentalists, more than really followers of Gay and the original neo-evangelicals of the 40s and 50s who wanted to move away from that. Right. Sure, they don't have the backwoods, antics of Bob Jones or Carl McIntyre or John R. Rice, but it's a new face, but it's still fundamentalism, not really evangelicalism.
Well, the magazine that he put out for a while was called The Fundamentalist.
Yeah.
The Falwell.
Jerry Falwell,
yeah.
right.
Did you have a follow-up question, Helen?
No, that's,
Okay.
I appreciate it.
I've been struck how much, starting this morning and then also this afternoon, the early 70s are key to so many of these developments. The big crusade in South Korea was 73, and Lausanne was 74, and Watergate and Nixon standing down was 74. It's feeling to me like Billy Graham and what would become known as evangelicalism almost started to diverge then. And when religious right comes in the later 70s and claims it, maybe there were gaps between the Graham trajectory and evangelical trajectory that weren't as clear for a while. But in retrospect now, if the early 70s were formative for Graham, if the later fundamentalists / evangelicals took any lessons from that, they seem to be the opposite lessons. Does that make sense?
George Marsden, in his book on fundamentalism and evangelicalism, declared the evangelical movement dead in, I think, 1976. That early. I wouldn't go along with that. That's awfully early, but that's what he says in that book.
Any more questions from the audience?
Roger, you've been probably dreading that I'm going to get up here. I'm from the newspaper. I have a question. I passed a billboard on I-35 that I guess you've probably seen it, Roger, has God coming into the flesh amongst us, and it has the president's picture up there.
Thank God I haven't seen it yet. It would probably make me throw up.
Well, it's pretty wild.
I've heard about
it.
And
it's famous. There's one in St. Louis, and I believe there's one in Waco, or it's several miles north of here. My question to you all, panelists, is Billy Graham a little bit to blame to where we are right now, the conversations that we're having in terms of, is this really evangelicalism? Is this spiritual even? Or is it some kind of a political movement masquerading as such? That's my question, and I'll go sit down and listen to your replies.
Well, wow, that's such a big question, and I don't know that anyone knows the answer to that. I will say, and this is the opinion page editor of the local newspaper, a good dear friend, and respect him highly, but I do think the media in America has tended to focus more than is necessary or even right on the political zeal of certain people who wave the evangelical banner, and they've kind of given them, I don't know that it's a matter of blame, but they have kind of given them the right to define evangelicalism for the rest of us. And I really trace that back to Phil Donahue and Larry King. I mean, those two guys, whenever they wanted an evangelical, who would they have on? Jerry Falwell or Pat Robertson or somebody that I would regard as more fundamentalist than an evangelical. So, no, I don't want to blame the media, but I do think the media hasn't helped us in this regard. So many of my friends who really are evangelical in spirit and theology have dropped the term and won't use it anymore. And I feel like I'm almost alone in some ways of, being, claiming it as a label, putting it on my forehead. I am still evangelical, but I'm really fighting against the media and the popular mind on that.
But going back to the question, though.
Yeah, go ahead.
The question was about Billy Graham. Has he laid the foundation, and this is a question to all three of you.
Yeah.
Has he laid the foundation for this, or is he blameless in this?
I hold him blameless. I'll just say that. I don't think he bears any guilt or responsibility for it.
What I would say there is that Billy Graham played a major role in making evangelical Christianity a powerful quarter of the population and a powerful force, and the religious right hijacked it. They set out after Goldwater's defeat to say, what can we do? And they saw that, and then after Carter, that there were 7,000 evangelical voters that had never voted before, and that there's all these people that are evangelicals that look like they're coming into politics, and they set out. The phase was the largest strand of uncut virgin timber in the political landscape, and they set out very consciously and carefully to do some heavy logging, and they were.
This is what Randall Balmer has written about in his books and spoken about here and elsewhere, the hijacking of evangelicalism by the religious right.
And then when having felt, and I think this has to do not just with the religious aspect, but having felt like you were on the outside, and now you're on the inside. When I attended Billy Graham's funeral, and behind me were three luminaries of the political, or activists in the religious, the religious right or the political realm, and they were talking about. A couple of them had Donald Trump's private cell number, and one of them had tried. It works. It still works. So there's that delight of being, a friend of the president, and having him be on our side, and we're the most powerful man in the world is on our side, and that I think that power is heady. Even when Jimmy Carter was president, and I talked to his, can't think of his name right now, but he was the liaison with the religious community, and he would talk about how easy it is for people to be so happy to be talking to the president that they want to agree with him. He said that White House iced tea can be mighty intoxicating.
So in that sense, you're saying, and I'm changing my mind, in that sense, Billy Graham kind of did set it up.
Well, by making, it's not so much that he set it up or saw that as an aim. He was interested in politics, and he liked being well liked by the politicians. He liked having the feeling of having some influence, and that pulled him under. Certainly, it seduced him sadly with Nixon, and what Grant was talking about last night about Billy Graham's obsequiousness when H.R. Haldeman and Nixon started making anti-Semitic remarks, and he would say, "Yep, the Jews, they have that power," and Graham said it's obsequiousness. I would say, I wouldn't have thought that particular term, but it's more being a good guest, but also going along with, and maybe there's not that much difference in the idea, but still going along with the president and his chief of staff, who I like going along with them when I can.
So maybe the answer is yes and no.
Yeah, sir, no.
I would see probably more continuities. And I'm thinking of Grant's keynote on ambition and humility with Billy Graham. And thinking ahead to knowing I was going to be moderating this panel, I was taking very good notes and thinking about how these traits that you can see in Graham, you can also see in evangelicalism, but more so the bad ones. The bad side of the ambition. Grant, you talked about seeking the advancement of his ego, hobnobbing and name dropping, posing for thousands of photos, commenting on things he knew nothing about, and being uninterested in the deeper worldviews of others. But there was a good side to Graham, using his charisma for advancing his evangelistic work, his personal probity, his public moral gyroscope, that I'm not seeing as much in what currently calls itself evangelicalism, or on the humility, the downside, meekness or timidity in the face of social injustice, and privileging loyalty over judgment. That I see. The good side of Graham's humility, the sincerity, willingness to face up to mistakes, self-forgetfulness, gratitude, and obedience to calling, not seeing that so much. So it is a continuation with Graham, but not the Graham we prefer to remember.
Well said.
Thank you.
Any final questions? Well then, thank all of our panelists. Thank you all for a great event.